one thing you hear a lot from trad thought shield maiden feminists, but not only, is this thing about how men have to man up, or women will step up and assume masculine responsibilities and fill masculine roles. And these trad thought shield maidens have a very, traditional European aesthetic, and they LARP as European traditionalists, but they nevertheless have very, very feminist aims and ambitions and dispositions and means and methods. And, they project that backwards in historical time, saying that traditional European societies were very gender egalitarian and they empowered women and so on and so forth. And much of this is either extremely exaggerated or outright untrue. But they do this whole woe is me routine. Where are strong Aryan men to come and save us, beautiful shield maidens in wheat fields? And it's not hard to see why, nobody's rushing to save these beautiful shield maidens in most cases, because they're usually, pretty unpleasant. They're past their prime in most cases. They've made a lot of bad decisions. They've been around the block, so to speak. And so, combine that with their sharp tongues and, haughty attitudes. And it's not hard to see why men aren't rushing to save these particular trad thought shield maidens from whatever danger they imagine themselves to be in. But this whole idea of women stepping up to fill masculine roles is tremendously counterproductive. And the whole thing about men manning up, that's just an attempt to shame men into adopting, let's say, traditionally masculine roles and responsibilities without any of the status or any of the benefits, and on terms dictated by entitled feminists, which isn't going to work. That's just not going to work. It's not working. It hasn't been working. It's not going to work. But the alternative of women standing up to fill those roles and assume those responsibilities isn't going to work either. And we only have to look at the example of, let's say, second wave feminism and women in the workplace to see why this is incredibly counterproductive. So, at one point in time, let's say maybe the 1950s, the majority of women were homemakers, mothers. They fulfilled a domestic role, a traditionally feminine role. And then, by the 1970s, feminists were agitating for access to education, access to the workplace, access to traditionally male institutions and traditionally male roles. And they got it. And so what happened? Well, in the first phase of this, so let's say phase one is most women are domestic and traditionally feminine. Phase two, now they're allowed to move into masculine spheres and adopt masculine roles, and it seems tremendously enticing to do so because, there's a lot of money involved, status, etc., all things that women, like all people, value and prize very highly. And it seems tremendously enticing to do that. Now, as more and more women move into, let's say, the paid economy, the market economy to work, then you're increasing the labor force, you're increasing the supply of labor, and therefore the price, wages go down. There's two main factors of production. There's capital and labor. And, capital is factories, tools, offices, stores, things like that, productive investments. And labor is, obviously labor, workers, hours, things like that. So holding one factor constant, you can always get more production out of that factor. Let's say the capital structure, the existing capital structure, you can always squeeze more production out of it by adding more labor. But there's, holding that capital constant, there's always a diminishing return for adding labor. So, if you double the labor supply, say, for the sake of simplicity, if you're increasing the labor pool from all men to all men and women, then you're approximately doubling the supply of labor. You're going to increase production, but you're going to greatly less than double it, because every worker you add is squeezing less extra production out of that capital. And so, by the time you get to the end of it, you've doubled the labor supply, but you've greatly less than doubled the total production. So double the number of workers are splitting much less than double the total production. So maybe production went up 50%. It didn't double. It went up greatly less than double. So it might have gone up 50% or half again, something like that. But now this new amount of production is being split between more workers. So automatically there's less production per worker that a worker could potentially take home. But it's actually even worse than that, because prices are set on the margin. So the prices in this case are wages. They're set on the margin. The marginal worker, the last worker you could add or subtract from the economy, is setting the wages for everyone before them, because companies are not going to pay every worker a different wage for the same work. They're going to try to get a more or less uniform and the lowest possible wage or salary or pay or whatever that they can for a particular job, and that's going to be the person they can replace you with is going to set your wage. So it's going to be the marginal worker out on the far end. The last worker you can add or subtract to the economy is going to be setting the rate of pay. And so what ends up happening is, not only is there greatly less than double the total production to split between double the amount of workers, but also a smaller share of that production is being captured by workers in the form of wages, and more of it is going to capital in the form of profits. So, the total amount of produce captured by workers under that scenario may not even have gone up at all. It may have even gone down. But in any case, you have more workers working more hours. So it's not necessarily a good situation for workers in general, not a good situation for families. But in the initial stages, when you're just opening up those opportunities to women, it seems tremendously enticing, because that hasn't happened yet. Women haven't made the switch in large numbers to working for pay. And so, they're only competing with the men who are already in the market. And so there's that restricted labor supply still, and there's those high wages. And that's what they're entering the market to obtain, those high wages, those high, pre-competition restricted labor supply wages. And so for the first few women who make that move, it's a tremendously enticing move. And that's the second phase. The third phase is that, once women do start to make that move in large numbers, and the wages start to go down and everything, then women start to feel like they have to work. Because now the status signaling regime is being defined by the two-income households. And so if you want to keep up with the Joneses, who have two incomes, you can't do that on one income. You have to have two incomes too. And it's not only that, but not only can you not signal like the Joneses on one income, but you can't even signal like you used to signal on one income, because that income has gone down, or it hasn't kept up with inflation. So it's gone down in relative terms, if not in absolute terms. So then women feel like they must work. And the next stage, the final phase, the fourth phase, which is coming, is that women definitely must work because men won't. And so there's been a progressive deterioration of the incentives for men to be productive and to contribute to the economy and contribute to society. Men used to do that because the reward was you get status, you get a wife, you get a family, you get children, and so on and so forth. There's a big payoff for being productive and contributing to the economy and contributing to society. That payoff has been progressively degraded, both through changes to marriage laws, which make marriage more costly and more risky to men, by giving women more status and wealth so that they don't feel like they need men as much, they don't desire men as much, by passing huge numbers of entitlements and handouts so that even if they don't work, women don't need men. And, all of this has tremendously degraded the payoff or the incentive for being a productive member of society if you're a man, and men have been dropping out. They've been dropping out of work, out of education, particularly higher education, and just not playing ball. And, the other thing is, feminization of the workplace. So the more women you have in the workplace, the more you have to cater to their sensibilities. So you have to have restrictive speech codes. They may not like competition. They might like a more consensus-driven environment, whatever that means. Regardless of how good or bad that is for the organization or the institution or for the men, that's what women want and that's what women demand in the workplace. And so, those changes are a nuisance and a cost and a risk and a hassle and a burden for men. And so, the more stuff you do in the workplace, it's not just about the pay, it's also about the conditions. And so if the conditions are worse and worse for men, you've got to pay them more to get them to do that. But, why would you pay them more when you could pay a woman who finds that environment appealing? So as women feminize the workplace, they're going to have to do more and more of the work because men are going to be less interested, and they're going to consider it more costly and more humiliating and everything else. So, the end state here is that women will just end up having to do everything productive and men will do nothing because, there's no payoff. Feminism has no way of motivating men. And so the more women step up into these masculine roles and responsibilities, the more stuck they're going to find themselves in those. And, the less they're going to be able to obtain from men in terms of doing those roles or helping with those roles. Because everybody's just following their incentives here. Women followed their incentives into the workplace. Now they're stuck there. Pretty soon they're going to be even more stuck there. Men are just following their incentives in terms of dropping out because there's no payoff, there's no motivation, there's no upside to any of this. And so, why bother in a great many cases? Everybody's just following their own individual rational incentives. So the feminist incentive is individually rational. The MGTOW incentive, if you want to call it that, is individually rational. And there are ideologies around these incentives and rationalizing them as a strategy, but the incentives predate the ideologies, predate the rationalizations. The incentives are just there, and people are following them. The problem is all of these individually rational incentives lead to a collective, mess. It's a clusterfuck. It's a total travesty. And so, women stepping up isn't going to help things out, isn't going to improve the situation in Western civilization. We're just going to get more of this, and we're going to get more single motherhood, and that's going to lead to political leftism, right? Because traditional nuclear families of the past were incredibly resistant to leftism because they were economically self-sufficient units. They didn't need leftism. Leftism didn't offer them anything that seemed appealing or necessary given their incentives. But, if you have single mothers, handouts and entitlements seem like an incredibly great thing. And then there are a variety of other social and political pathologies that arise from that. So it's just going to make it worse. And, there's not really anything women can do by stepping up or standing up. And you're not going to be able to shame men into doing that if you're not constructing incentives that reward them for doing that. If you're just, browbeating them and harrying them and nagging them, it's not going to accomplish anything. And so, I guess my conclusion would be that yes, men do ultimately have to man up and solve all of these problems because nobody else will. All right, so it falls to us by default, but that's not going to be by doing this stuff in exchange for nothing, just to cater to feminist sensibilities. That's going to be by constructing norms and institutions and laws to harmonize these conflicting interests.